Nathaniel Brown, welcome to Nonstop Politics.
Hi, happy to be here finally.
Good to see you. Good to have you with me today. We've got so much to talk about. So much has been happening the last 4 or 5 weeks. Obviously, we're going to talk about the main theme of the podcast episode, which is what does it mean to be Black in Britain? We're going to talk about issues to do with racism, issues to do with how we deal with racism today, what life is like being Black. But before we get to that, of course, we wouldn't be having this discussion at all if it wasn't for the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis a few weeks ago. I mean, I assume you've seen the video. What
Yeah.
was your initial reaction? How did you feel when you saw it?
Well, sadly, it wasn't really indifference, but more resignation in the fact that it's something you've seen before and something you've heard about before, and obviously it was much more chilling this time to see like someone literally dying in front of your face and people telling someone to get off him. You're killing him and he's just standing there staring at the people as if they're the crazy ones, and it's tragic. But yeah, it was, I guess, I don't know if apathy is the right word, if it is, but either way, it was somewhat something you've heard about so much often. It's kind of diminished the fact that you've just seen another Black person, unfortunately, and needlessly killed by somebody who was supposed to be protecting and preventing deaths from happening. So it was definitely sad and tragic and disappointing that it's happening again, and it's happened again. So yeah.
You thought it was sad and tragic, of course. You were horrified by it, but your first reaction was, you think you already knew how things are going to play out. You initially thought that nothing was going to change after this, I assume.
Not more that I knew how things were going to play out, but more that it's like when you hear on the news that another child's been kidnapped or murdered or death in the news, and whilst hearing about death is always sad, it gets to the point where hearing another story about someone getting killed on the news, you don't really feel the same level of sadness each time, or the same level of shock, I guess would be the best word. And that in itself is tragic, because it shouldn't be shocking that police officers have that another police officer has killed another citizen of the country, regardless of race or color, that killed another citizen of the country who didn't deserve to or shouldn't have been killed. And especially when there is in a situation where the officer had seamlessly had apparently had full control of the situation, and the person wasn't a threat, he wasn't holding a gun, he wasn't in a somewhat misleading position that the officer might have felt threatened by for their life, and felt the need to put their knee on the windpipe. I believe it wasn't even the correct protocol for even detaining or handling a criminal in that position anyway. So he did the wrong thing to somebody who didn't deserve it, and once again it led to another tragic death of a Black person. And whilst they may not have been innocent at all, as many people in the past have been, it still doesn't mean it doesn't make it any less tragic that it happened.
Absolutely. Oh, my microphone just went for a second. There we go. We're back. So I think, I think that's a very interesting insight. I think to your point, one of the reasons why you're probably thinking that is you probably initially thought, well, another Black person's been killed by police, maybe justice won't be done. And initially, I think there were feelings to that point because, of course, Derek Chauvin, who is the ex-police officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck, he was initially charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. So third-degree murder is where it wasn't intentional, but once they started, once he was on his neck, he had a complete disregard for life. It wasn't premeditated, but he showed a disregard for life.
Yeah.
But then after a bit of outcry, that was then upgraded to second-degree murder. So it still wasn't premeditated, but it got to the stage where he did intend to kill him. So once he began putting his knee on his neck. So I think your sense of apathy is definitely justified in those circumstances. But when you look, we're now 4 or 5 weeks on from that. When you look at the reaction from the US, the UK, and all around the world, do you think that the tide is changing? I mean, look at all the protests that have taken place. Look at all of the brands that are now addressing Black Lives Matter. The movement's had a sort of resurgence. The movement's about 7 years old now, but it seems like it's really come back into the fore. So
Oh
does
yeah,
that
definitely.
bring you any comfort?
It brings me some comfort because, you know, already I'm like, when I saw it, my resignation was, I guess, like you said a bit, that nothing would happen. But it was more the fact I've seen this so many times before that it's almost, you know, like a lot of people's responses to mass shootings in the US, like you've seen it so many times before, it becomes a sort of, you know, cycle, like something you expect to happen, and it's something you shouldn't expect to happen at all. But you're right in the sense it was also due to the fact that I felt that maybe things wouldn't, you know, it'd be the same thing. People would make noise about it and nothing would happen. And, you know, I feel somewhat less so that this might be the case now. But at the same time, you know, I feel I still hold doubts that much will change, that there'll be much more. I mean, I still hold doubts that much, you know, the significant change that is needed to happen will happen because of this. But it has definitely inspired a lot more awareness, a lot more support for the problem than it did before, several years ago, when Black Lives Matter resurged after forgotten the name of the person who unfortunately, you know, tragically was killed by a police person in that sense. But I remember a few years ago, a few years back, Black Lives Matter came up because of this same thing happening again. And, you know, initially at the beginning of this whole protest thing, I was a bit worried that the same things would happen as well. And also I was worried from the arguments on the side that people would use the lockdown as a reason to discourage people from feeling upset, like protesting about it. People would say, oh, the police officer, like, you know, all the common arguments that come up about how, you know, police officer was just doing his job, or, you know, it was an accident, or, you know, he was a criminal, so, you know, it's not so bad, or other ridiculous arguments really that doesn't justify, you know, a enforcer of the law killing a citizen who shouldn't have been killed. And, you know, that in itself, the fact that I was worried about that happening again, obviously fed into my resignation. But this time around, there has been a lot more, like you said, there has been much more brands on support with the message. There's been a lot of, you know, protests in Minnesota. I believe there was even talks, and they've actually agreed to defund the police, as they said, in some certain degrees, which my opinions about it are a bit, you know, I'm worried it may not be the best decision, but if they come up with a better, I do agree that the police, you know, force probably there needs to be definitely changes to make things better for the community, but whether or not that may have been the best idea, you know, we'll have to wait and see. But it's definitely proof that it's regardless of my opinions, I can definitely agree that it's evidence that things have changed or things are changing. And, you know, this will then lead into, you know, the taking down of statues and stuff, and, you know, more people, more like governments and councils and stuff actively taking down statues and,
Yeah.
you know, pictures of people who have been shown to be not as great as they, you know, somebody deserving of a statue, you know, should be. You know, so I'm both confident that change will happen, but I'm also doubtful that there'll be some hiccups along the road that will either derail change or hinder it, or, you know, even from the side of Black Lives Matter. Like, for example, initially there was a lot of riots and stuff happening, a lot of violence going on, which I was worried would derail the whole, you know, good and justified meaning of the protests. And because, you know, regardless of how sad this is, I don't support or wouldn't say it's right to go around burning your own community because of, you know, life that was unjustly taken. But at the same time, I don't think it's justified to go around burning, you know,
Yeah.
community stuff, because I don't think that will actually come up with much change in itself, and it would, if anything, take away from the message and discourage people from supporting you. But, you know, I felt that we've stayed, at the end of the day, you know, looking at how things are, we've stayed true to the true meaning of, you know, of really promoting what the cause should be. And I think that things may change. So I'm hopeful, but, you know, few doubts still.
Exactly. And you make a really good point about protests and previous folks that have been killed as well. A few people, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, have been killed in the past. We had Trayvon Martin in 2012
Yeah,
as
right.
well. And in terms of protests, I mean, the protests that you were talking about, they've been quite extreme, especially in the United States. You've had some very, very extreme protests over there. I
You
mean, the
have.
irony.
I would say that it was more mixed in the sense that there were some areas which there were definitely, even at the beginning, there were definitely peaceful protests.
Definitely.
But yeah, there was a lot of attention given to the extreme protests, but I believe that not enough attention was given to, you know, peaceful protests that were actually happening as well. But yeah, there were too much, because there should be none in my opinion, but there were a lot of violence and violent protests going on, which threatens the movement, in my opinion. But yeah, um,
let me put a couple points to you. Let me see if I can make you feel a bit more optimistic.
mhm.
I'm sensing some optimism from you, but let me see if I can make you a little bit more optimistic about the change that could be coming. So we have the Minnesota case, which is unfolding. Have you also heard about what's going on in Atlanta with a man called Rayshard Brooks?
No, I have not.
So Rayshard Brooks was pulled over. No, he wasn't pulled over. He was found in his car asleep. And then the police knocked on his window. He was asleep. They breathalyzed him, did some checks for half an hour. They had good interactions with him, and that was fine. But then they tried to handcuff him, and he began to resist arrest. And he tried to run away. He grabbed one of the officers' tasers. And then he tried to run away, and eventually one of the officers shot him and killed him in Atlanta. Now, that has obviously sparked a lot of controversy. There was even a restaurant that was burned down in protest at the fact that this could happen. And what I'll say to you is this: in that case and in the Minnesota case, I think one of the things that we're seeing this time around that we haven't seen before is officers beginning to now be actually held accountable. So in the Derek Chauvin case, he's now facing 3 separate charges. He's facing charges of unintentional second-degree murder, which carries a 40-year sentence. He's facing third-degree murder, which is a 25-year sentence, and he's facing second-degree manslaughter, which is a 10-year sentence. And that is quite extraordinary. In the Atlanta case, the officer that shot the African-American man, Rayshard Brooks, could actually face the death penalty if he's found guilty. So I'm thinking that this is something that where in previous cases in the last decade or so, officers haven't been held accountable to that extent. Obviously, they haven't been prosecuted as yet. Trials are still yet to go ahead. But does the news that they're beginning to be held accountable, does that give you any optimism for the future?
Oh no, yeah, it gives me optimism in the fact that there's definitely energy moving towards holding police officers more accountable, because the way the system, particularly in America, is, it's particularly hard for police officers to hold either each other accountable, for other facets of the law to hold other facets of the law accountable, and generally, it's built on the system that police officers, just by being police officers, should be trusted to know that be trusted that they did the right thing in a hard situation. And that trust is somewhat justified, because I know, whilst police officers definitely, many police officers are flawed, I will stand by saying that, I believe the majority of police officers are just, people who mean well and are put in difficult situations on a day-to-day basis and do the best that they can. And it is a hard job. I've listened to stories of people who, from police officers, people, non-police officers, who've had to be faced with, almost inconceivably, impossibly, difficult situations, which I myself wouldn't know what to what would do in that situation. There was even a news story about a civil rights activist who, for a day, was brought on to do police training and was put in an actual real police situation, and then he himself, a civil rights activist, shot the person who was running up to him
Oh my
in
God.
a situation which, similar to police officer, many people would call controversial. He didn't actually real life shoot him. It was a fake training situation, but put in that situation, the civil rights activist shot the person. And it doesn't at all justify, police officers killing innocent people, because you want to be able to trust police officers, and they shouldn't, under any circumstances, be killing people who shouldn't be killed. And same way, somebody who was flying an airplane, you want to be able to have the security that, the person who's flying the plane is saying will do the best they can to keep you alive, and won't, for reasons that could have been totally avoided, and because they weren't properly they can't properly handle the situation, suddenly just crash the plane into the ground. Or in the same way, doctors are held accountable for incompetence during surgeries. In America, being a doctor and making a mistake, you could get sued and lose your job, and a lot of other things as well, even legally held accountable for your mistake, regardless of whether or not, you intended to kill the person. If you're merely incompetent, that, and fairly, in my opinion, should hold you accountable, because you've damaged, ruined, or possibly in some cases ended the life of somebody who shouldn't have, been killed. And you want to have the same level of accountability for police officers. However, you should also take into account that police officers face a lot of hardship in their jobs. And, they should be treated much like anybody in the other situation, same as, African-American people faced with police officers, much like how I expect them should be treated fairly and rationally. You should treat police officers fairly and rationally in their situation. So for the situation you described to me about Rachel Brooks, in his situation, I whilst the person was running away from police officers, so I wouldn't say it may have been the best decision for him to shoot him. I feel the fact that he resisted arrest may be something you want to hold, the law enforcement, the court maybe want to take into account when it comes to judging what punishment he should receive. But he should definitely be held accountable for that, as should all police officers. So it has given me optimism that has been happening and more. And the fact that even the police officer in the George Floyd case, that he lost his job in situations in the past that hasn't happened before. And whilst obviously there's not the most or even the bare minimum that should be done, it is still a step forward in the right direction. So, I am optimistic, as I said before, that change will happen. And already I believe that change has already happened, and things will be much better than they were 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But, we're still not there yet. And history has shown that, it will take longer for change to happen than we may want. So I am optimistic is basically what I'm trying to say. But I am somewhat doubtful that change will happen as quickly as, it may appear.
Now, picking up on your point about police accountability, I think you made very, 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 very good points about how also think about what the police are going through, and make sure that we have their feelings known as well, and understand from their perspective how things are too. It's interesting because there were 4 officers involved in the George Floyd killing, and I think either 2 or 3 of them were only in their first week on the job. So the argument goes, the attorney for one of them, I watched an interview, the attorney for one of the officers, I can't remember who it was, I think his name was Thomas Lane, is one of the officers. He was only in his first week on the job. So obviously you're not a lawyer. I'm not asking you a legal question here as to how that would change the thing, but that really does feed into your argument about, we got to understand things from police officers' perspective too. So what do you make of the fact that some of the officers were in their first week, and how that could have maybe tempered their judgment in the way that they acted in that situation, in not stopping Derek Chauvin from killing George Floyd?
In that case, I would say that once again, police officers face a lot of hardship, and it is unfortunate for them. I would have said that it is unfortunate for them to be put in that situation in the first week of the job, but they should have had. I do believe they should have had at least some instinct that the police officer should have gotten off his neck, or at least tried to stop him and get him off, or have seen that George Floyd was struggling for breath and there was a risk that he would have died from that. What the police officer who was involved, who I keep getting his name, but whatever the fact that he was the one who put his neck, knees on his George Floyd's neck, they should have at least had some semblance of an idea that he shouldn't have been doing that. and they should have had some semblance of idea that that's not the right protocol to follow. But at the same time, you know, the situation should be assessed fairly, and I don't think in any way that the other three police officers should face exactly the same level of punishment as the police officer who, you know, killed George Floyd face. But they should still be held somewhat accountable, or there should be at least some level of punishment for being involved, because also they held him down. They didn't stop the situation, and you know, in an effort, they're involved, much like, you know, somebody who's involved in, you know, a gang crime. If you're there and you can see legally, if you're at the scene of a crime with the perpetrators and you are aware of the crime happening and you could have in any way stopped the crime, and you were, like, you know, you were affiliated with the gang members, you too would be held legally accountable for the crime being committed. Especially if, for say, somebody was murdered in, like, say somebody breaks into a house and murders the people in the house, and you're there in the getaway car, despite you not committing the murder, you are held accountable for that because you aided that crime crime happening. So in that way, I would say it's only fair that the other police officers should also face punishment, but obviously not to the same level as the you know, main police officer involved.
Precisely. And the three other officers, it's worth noting, they've all been charged with aiding and abetting murder. So, you know, they were there and were part of the action. So that's exactly right, as you outlined. Let's now move to talk about our experiences. You know, we're two Black men, we've lived in this country all our life. And of course, you know, whether or not we faced direct racism or indirect racism, it's obviously something that's still a problem in this country. And so I want to tackle this question about what it means to be Black in Britain. And I have come across a really, really interesting article by a journalist called Darren Lewis. He is the football writer for the Mirror newspaper, and he wrote a very, very interesting piece. He wrote essentially what was a letter to Boris Johnson, because he wants the Prime Minister to understand what it's like living as a Black person in Britain and the daily struggles that comes with. And reading through this piece, there were some really, really interesting things that definitely did resonate. So I wanted to read a few lines from this, give you a few scenarios, and then let's talk about some of these and see how much we can relate, because definitely I'm sure some of these you'll absolutely be able to relate to. So he begins his letter by responding to the fact that Boris Johnson, in the wake of the revival of the Black Lives Matter movement, is launching a cross-governmental commission into racial inequality. You know, the pros and cons of that have been debated in the media. We're not going to go into too much detail about that specifically, but Darren Lewis makes the point that the Prime Minister has often been known to use racist language at times. Again, that's been well documented, and things like that. But let's go through some of these scenarios that Darren Lewis talks about, and let's see what you make of them. So he says, if the PM needs a hand understanding what it's like to be Black in Britain, here is a brief glimpse into life as a Black man in Britain. So first of all, he says, to be Black in this country is to be seen as a threat first and a person later. What do you make of that?
I think that for a lot of people is the case. A lot of people, my dad and my parents can attest to that. I myself believe it's much more nuanced than that, and that for Black people, my personal opinion is that, you know, for Black people, we go through a lot of struggles in this country, you know, individually as a community, a lot of which have been put forward to us, like, you know, simply because our color of skin is different to or darker than that of, you know, the main people, you know, the larger population of this country. And, you know, it's in that itself has made life harder. It has made us be seen as a threat most of the time. But personally, I can't say that I've necessarily been seen as a, you know, all the time been as a threat first and a person second. But that in itself has simply been the way I act. And a lot of the times I believe it's simply because a lot of the people I come across don't see me as, you know, the typical Black person. A lot of time, even from school, I'd have people calling me coconuts because the way I act makes me seem like a white person inside of a black person. And, you know, that in itself makes me seem like, you know, I'm different to the normal black person, as if a black person has to act a particular way in order to be considered black. That itself is mainly the way I've been discriminated throughout my life personally. But, you know, that in itself, whilst obviously it has the harrowing and sad truth and being seen as not black because of the way I act, as if, you know, speaking the way I do and acting the way I do is unbecoming or unlike the regular black person. But it also means that I myself hasn't been seen as a threat. But the fact that I haven't been seen as a threat in that situation in itself is, you know, where the discrimination lies. But you know, even then, I would say that times have changed, and there are quite many people in this country, unfortunately, been raised by, you know, people who have, you know, risen above the primitive feelings of fear for people who don't look like you, and they've been raised better, and they learn better, and they learn it. You know, that they've become better people, and they know it's people are much more than the color of their skin and people they look like. So to answer your question, no, I don't think that's entirely the case, but I can definitely say for a lot of black people that is true.
It's funny that you've brought up the coconut and Oreo factor already, which I was going to come to that actually. There's one scenario where I think that's definitely true. I've had exactly the same experience. Everything you said is exactly my experience too. In my experience, I've been reflecting on this quite a bit. Honestly, personally, I resonated with a lot of the things that Darren Lewis says, but I can't personally say that I've ever been directly racially abused or anything like that. And you mentioned the coconut Oreo chalk ice scenario. I don't, you know, this is a podcast about, you know, Black Lives Matter, and we should all be, you know, working towards improving Black lives and making Black people respected. But I think there is a point where you make about the fact that a lot of the abuse that you've had is from other Black people. That's exactly the same experience for me. And, you know, I kind of feel bad that going down this path. I didn't want to go down this path, but you've raised it, so why not? Because when you look at one of the things that Darren Lewis says, he says, being Black is told at least once in your life, you don't sound Black by a white person you meet in person after speaking over the phone. But in actual fact, it's mostly other Black people that say, oh, you don't sound Black, you're an Oreo, and things like that. And so that's very interesting, because I think sometimes we overlook the fact that, you know, when we talk about Black people are not a monolith. You know, Black people come in all different kinds, all different shapes and sizes. The points that you make, they're just absolutely, they resonate a lot. Being told, oh, you know, you're not Black enough because you don't sound a certain way, or you don't talk a certain way, you don't listen to this kind of music, you don't wear these kind of clothes. And so I would say, when it comes to that scenario, most of the abuse is from other Black people. I feel like this topic, the Oreo question, the coconut question, could be an entire podcast that you and I can do in a few months' time, because we could really delve deep in that. That's very, very deep. But I think regardless of whether or not we are deemed to be coconuts or Oreos, if a policeman stops us, if a policeman sees us in our car, it doesn't matter at the end of the day what we talk like, or it doesn't matter how we present ourselves or how we dress or what music we listen to. The fact of the matter is that you and I both have Black skin. So to that police officer or to that work colleague, we are still Black at the end of the day, whether or not we sound a certain type of way or not.
Unfortunately, that is the case for a lot of situations where Black people move in front of the police, where they see, like you said, the threat first person, second. That is particularly the case for a lot of, you know, people I've spoken to who are older than me or either the same age as well, where they've come across a police and that's what they see. And I partly sympathize with the police in the sense that as a policeman, you have to assess a situation, the risk factors, as quickly as possible. And the problem comes is when you see black people and you associate black people with those risk factors. You associate black people with crime, you associate them with drugs, you associate them with all the parts of our community and culture, which, you know, I'm not going to lie exist, but it's not everything. It's not all we are. We're not all, you know, low tracksuit wearing, you know, drug smoking, you know,
That's a typical stereotype, isn't it?
gangsters, yeah, walking down the road with, you know, golden teeth and crap. Like, that's not all we are. And even if that's the, you know, the few people in our community, as it is even with white people, there are many white people as well who are criminals and stuff. That's, you know, you shouldn't see that and feel that's the only way to treat, you know, somebody who looks that way.
Yeah.
Because even then, you know, a situation, you should only stick to a situation on what you have to go on, and them being a black person is not something that is enough to go on for them being, you know, deserving of being treated like a criminal. And for a lot of police officers, whilst they have been, you know, taught to assess risk factors and stuff as quickly as possible to prevent themselves from being put in danger, you know, what needs to be done is that police officers need to break that association of black people with danger. They need to break that. And I think that's what's most important when it comes to reforming police and stuff. But regardless, that's yeah, it is a problem. And whilst I'm definitely, like I've said before, I don't think all police officers are that way. There is definitely too many police officers are that way. And it, you know, it needs to change.
You know, again, it's all about perception and it's all about culture, and these things are deep rooted. You know, there's a analogy, you know, it's not necessarily about bad apples, it's about the poison tree, and it's about how that deep intrinsic, you know, culture affects us as people. When we talk about the whole coconut Oreo question, it's also important to know, yes, so, you know,
with that in particular, it shows how deeply racism has poisoned both sides, like every facet of the community, and the fact that, you know, we begin to see ourselves and each other differently, and we begin to resent each other because of, you know, either prejudices and racist, you know, views that we've had to put up with whole life. We see either we begin to fear other black people not around with much, or we begin to see each other as competition, you know, as rather than a whole community, and we turn on each other from it. Like with me, my own experiences, it has affected the way I've interacted with, you know, other people my same race and color, because I constantly I've had to put up with being told that I don't act like the regular black person.
same.
And yeah, yeah, mood. But you know, you know, being told that affects the way you interact with other people of the same color, because, you know, you constantly feel awkward around them, because you feel like as if you don't belong with them, because the way you act means you belong with white people. But even then, that and that in itself is heartbreaking. And
Isn't that so annoying? Doesn't that really annoy you?
It does more than annoy me.
Isn't that the most annoying thing ever?
Yeah, because even when you're hearing it, what annoys me more is when you're hearing it from other black people, because it's as if people who act, either speak or even act like, wait, for example, I've heard many stories from my mom about other black people who become jealous of other black people's success, and they make them seem as if, you know, achieving success made them less black or white, and more white, as if black people can't be successful, or black people can't talk, as if they've been, you know, as if they've gone to Oxford, or, you know, black people can't do this and do that. And the thing, black people should be able to do anything a white person can. In my ideal world, being black, the only definition of a black person is someone who has more melanin in their skin. That's all that defines us. That should be all that defines us, and nothing else. And you know, whilst we have a lot of culture and stuff in history, which is important because it makes our history as a community, makes us who we are, and it forms our identity, it shouldn't be what defines our history. Shouldn't be what defines who we are right now, and it should be defined who we are as a community, and it shouldn't define our race, basically. So it's sad when you hear it from other black people, and sad when you hear it from other white people, but it's even sadder because it shows that, you know, racism has dominated a lot of our society.
It is really sad and quite demoralizing as well. Because then you just immediately feel, well, I can't fit in anywhere. You know, you're like, oh, you know, don't even bother talking to them lots, because they're not gonna want to engage, you know, and then you start thinking, is there something wrong with you? Is it my problem? Is it, you know, someone else's problem? What's happened to you? But it is very annoying. Mostly comes from other black people, occasionally from other white people. There was a moron who I worked with earlier in the year at a famous department store, which will remain nameless, because I enjoyed working there. But one of the other temps who I was working with was like, "Oh yeah, you're an Oreo because you talk like a white guy and you're black on the outside." And he obviously couldn't sell any clothes because he was no good. So therefore he had to like try and be like a
I
big
like
man and
that
try and
shade.
come at me because I was better than him, because I can sell more clothes and stuff. So obviously, you know, you have those attacks that, you know, come from other white people, but it is mostly from other black people. Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement should pay more attention to colorism within our community? Or do you think it should really focus on the broad brush aspect of this thing, considering that, you know, for example, with police interactions or in everyday life, it's skin color that matters initially, you know, threat first, person later, as Darren Lewis writes? Should it be a focus on the broad brush, or should Black Lives Matter and other organizations really like take a deep look at ourselves and understand why do you hate certain black people, because they're more successful than you are, or because they talk better than you, or not better, but they talk differently or have different interests? What do you think about that?
So to do with your first point, I think Black Lives Matter should be focusing on, you know, all aspects that devalue black life in comparison to all life, you know, all others, and definitely colorism and, you know, tensions within our own community is a part of that, because when we devalue each other because of, you know, structures or, you know, racially discriminative views and perceptions, you know, we devalue what it means, you know, we devalue black life. We feed into that perception that we're just, you know, a community of infighting, violent people who can't get along and, you know, who can't succeed. And we can't continue to feed into that by fighting amongst ourselves and by, you know, holding each other back. And we need to lift each other up and do better as a community. And that is an important part of making Black Lives Matter. If we can't value ourselves, how can we expect other races to value us? So it is definitely an important part. And I think Black Lives Matter should definitely tackle that issue and work with other groups that tackle that issue. But yeah, with police, the you know, the black people against police and, you know, police brutality and all that is a very important topic that definitely needs to be tackled, because, you know, I've heard many statistics are saying that, you know, the amount of you know, the amount of black people who have reportedly been, you know, brutalized by the police or even killed by police, not as much as white people, and all those other statistics. And regardless of, you know, I'm not sure about the statistics myself because I don't do much research on the topic, but regardless, it's still important, even if it's, you know, 2 black people a year getting killed by police, because when, you know, one bad apple spoils the barrel is true when, you know, those are the only apples on earth, like, or those apples are important with enforcing the law in your community. Like, you are the police, the police rely on society's trust in them. Like, a whole part of their importance is the fact that we need to be able to trust the police in order for them to function. Like, if nobody trusts the police, nobody likes the police, if nobody believes the police are fairly going to represent them, how are they going to be able to go about doing their job safely and doing their jobs effectively if, you know, every black person, every white person, every person around them seemingly hates them, and they're trying to both enforce law and defend themselves? And it's just going to feed into a cycle where police are constantly trying to, you know, defend themselves against what they believe are, you know, outwardly hateful people who, you know, hate them. And even the other way around, as if, you know, it is important because, you know, security is an important part of a functioning society, and, you know, security needs to be, you know, society needs to be fair to everybody. You can't have law enforcement that's helping, one group of people more than another, because then you can't trust the field system as a whole. So it is an important issue that needs to be tackled, as well as, like I've said, our divisions in our own community.
In that vein of talking about how certain people act, as how Black people act, let me give you this scenario that Darren Lewis writes about. Being Black is having to activate your kind, smiley nature to actively, constantly set white people at ease on your initial meeting. Go.
Yeah, I can say that's definitely the case for a lot of people around me. You constantly, you know, you, a lot of people have to put on this facade or act a certain way, or they feel that they have to act a certain way around white people because, they don't want to put on, the whole perception of being an aggressive person. Like, I can tell from my mom at work, she's had a lot of interactions where she's been accused of being, aggressive or, angry.
An angry Black woman.
Yeah, basically that whole stereotype of the angry
Every
Black
time.
woman, because she's speaking up for herself
Every
in a
time.
discussion where, she feels like she's being mistreated. And, that in itself is, unfair. And it's not right that we as a community have to act a certain way to put the other community, the other race at ease, because we shouldn't have to act a certain way. Why? Because as I've heard from today from another, family friend, they've quite eloquently said that in a lot of situations, white people don't have to go about their way acting a certain way around Black people. They don't have to invest time and effort trying to understand us, or trust us, or even just respect us. They don't have to, because they can go about their entire lives without doing any of that, without understanding the life of a Black person. We have to. We can't survive in a society without understanding how white people think and how they act and how to interact with them properly, or how to interact with other white people around us. And that in itself is something that needs to change, because you can't have a society where one race must learn to appease the other, because that's not a fair society.
Everything you said there is just, it just resonates so perfectly. I mean, I remember I think pretty much most jobs that I've had so far, I wouldn't say that I acted differently necessarily. Certainly working in a department store, you don't act a different way, but you've certainly got to put on a good face, because you're in a customer facing role. You have to make sure you're being polite and things like that. That's different. But I think working in an office environment, for example, it's one of these things that's really always on my mind, trying to make sure that I'm not doing anything or saying anything that makes me come across as sort of angry or miserable. There's typical stereotypes.
Yeah.
You think about with Black men, it's always in the back of my mind. I need to talk to make sure that I, make people feel comfortable. I even the way I sit, you sit a certain way. You have to keep smiling. I'm a natural smiler. I always smile. You know that more than anyone. But it's I have to overemphasize just to make sure that people aren't nervous. That definitely rings true. Because at the end of the day, if you're starting out in a workplace, in your first job, you want to impress. You don't want to be putting people off. And so that's always in the back of my mind. Not something I'd probably have to think about if I was a white person. You just walk in, you be yourself. People will take it or leave it. But I think being Black, that's always on the back of your mind, making sure that you're able to get on with people, and also sort of subconsciously put people at ease and actively work to make sure that you're not,
Another thing I'll say on that is, it reminds me of back in secondary school again. I had an incident where, I unfortunately kicked another member of my class because, they were being aggravating, and they were trying to wind me up. Unfortunately, they got the better of me, and anger got the better of me and decided to kick them. That was my first and only ever outburst of violence at that school at that time. Actually,
Really?
no, at that time, throughout my whole time there, that was the only time I'd ever did anything violent or serious like that. And yeah, despite the fact that I was, if anything, a really good student, I was, I pride myself, and even I got, as far as I know, the highest amount of credits actually in that school at one time, like ever in history. And master was short-lived at that time. It was only like the third or fourth year of them doing so. Like I held the records, and so basically I was a good student. And yeah, I was put on like a report cards and told that I need to manage my anger.
No.
Yeah. Like
What?
I remember one teacher. Yeah, I remember one teacher telling my mom that people may find me intimidating.
Oh my God.
Yeah, despite the fact that, as known, I was the least intimidating person in my entire class. Like literally, I was very easygoing, to the point that I was literally just taking the mick out of because of how easygoing I was. Like that's it.
Nathaniel, there are alarm bells ringing in my head right now.
Yeah, I was yeah, literally, I was secondary school. I was like the most easiest, laid back kind of harmless guy in my school, in my class. Actually, arguably year, and yet I was put on a severe report card for anger and such. And that in itself was quite
Mikey.
annoying. I didn't really care much because I was a good student, so it wasn't like I was going to possibly get punished more than I already was. But it's the fact that one outburst led to me being seen as a potentially angry person is what.
And being stereotyped that way.
Yeah, that is what pissed me off.
There are so many public figures who are black that tell very similar stories. I don't know if you've heard of someone called Misha B. She was in the X Factor back in 2011, and that was like going back 9 years. And only now we're hearing about her trauma that she suffered over the last 8-9 years. When she was on the show, she was accused of being a bully, and she was humiliated by two of the judges on the show. They said that you come across as very I can't remember the exact words, but you come across in a certain type of way, very angry, overconfident. And this is a black girl, Nisha B, being told, "Oh, you're too overconfident. You're intimidating." And at the time, you think, "Well, it's just a bit of bullying. It's X Factor. You know what it's like." But now you look back all these years later in the context of what's going on, and alarm bells just ring off completely. And you think, oh my God, what they're saying about her, you wouldn't hear about anyone else. If it was someone else, if it was a white person, they'd be like, wow, I love the confidence that you were displaying. And
Yeah,
there was also
see,
a distraction as well.
The fact that alarm bells are now ringing in your head is another show of how badly, we need to change things, because you can't, when these things are a constant problem, it puts a whole community constantly on edge. Like we constantly feel as if this interaction may be racially discriminated, or this person is doing that because they hate my color and race, and then you try and act certain ways to avoid being seen that way, or you feel like you have to be quiet more, or in certain situations, because they may see that because you're black, you're aggressive and you're angry and you shout a lot, and other people may seem intimidating. As they've said, you've got, as Daryl Lewis said, you've got, is putting on this smile and pretending you are someone you're not, or you're pretending you should be more, meek and quiet, simply because people may be put off by who you are. So yeah, just like that. So
right,
yeah,
right, and talking about your school experience is interesting, because again, in the last week, I've been looking back at my secondary school experience, and when I look at some of the things that happened to me through the prism of race, it's funny because I was just like you, quiet, didn't talk too much, had my group of friends, was in lessons. I never really spoke up in lessons that much, especially in the early few years of secondary school. But then there were these occasions when I would do something, like a joke or something. I'd get into big trouble. I'd have this teacher just shout at me all the time. There are about 4 or 5 occasions where there's one teacher who I'm not going to reference to, but people who knew me from secondary school know exactly who I'm talking about. If you're listening from secondary school, people who are listening will know exactly the person I'm talking about. But this one teacher in particular, for about 3 years, on about 4 occasions, would absolutely just go after me for what I perceive to be no reason. When I look at it through the lens of racism, I don't know if I can say it was motivated by racism, because there were a lot of black kids in our school. It was majority black, I think, majority black and Asian minority. So I don't think it was because of racism that this teacher was a racist. But there were times where, you know, I'd be with other students and I would do something like silly. I don't know. There was some weird game that we played. I was playing with a white person, and then, you know, he caught me doing something. I don't know. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he pulled me aside, literally pulled me aside, took me upstairs to the classroom and gave me a massive roasting for no reason. And this happened on about 4 occasions in about 3 years. And I was just like, what? Why are you coming after me for? I'm like the ideal student. I don't say a word. I do all my homework on time. I do everything right. Why are you attacking me for? And I can't say it was because of racism, because I genuinely despise this teacher to this day. I still have PTSD to this day because of this teacher. And, you know, there were, you know, and I should say, you know, there were some fantastic teachers at my secondary school. I had some amazing, amazing teachers there. It's the few that what I perceive to be treated me very unfairly. And now looking through the prism of race, I can't help but think, you know, was that racially motivated? Was I just shouted down to sort of like say, stop being like this, stop being overconfident? You know, it's an interesting conundrum. But I'm just so shocked that a teacher said to you that you were an angry person. I just can't believe that a teacher said that to you. I'm gobsmacked. I can't even imagine how stupid they are. I mean, what the hell is wrong with them?
Oh, it was mainly one teacher, but regardless, it was, yeah, it was a stupid situation, and you know, I both hold myself because I really shouldn't have lashed out at the person like that, but at the same time, you know, I feel I was, you know, treated unfairly in that situation, and you know, who I was as a person wasn't really taken into account, but it was just
Absolutely.
taken for face value. So you know, it is a shame, but you know, like I said before, I'm hopeful things change. Things have changed, I think, and you know, things will and are changing. So you know,
Absolutely.
you've just got to hope. You know, as I like to think, you know, this world just needs a little less hate, a little more love. So yeah.
Absolutely, Nathaniel.
Yeah.
Have you ever been on holiday before?
Yes.
And one of Darren Lewis's scenarios here is this: being black is having to Google a country before you go there on holiday just to check that it isn't racist. Have you ever had to Google a country before traveling there just to check that it's not racist, Nathaniel Brown?
I mean, I'd say no, simply because I don't go on holidays that often. But I will not lie and say that racism hasn't played in factor into how I view a country before I go there and how I act and how I'm worried. For example, I went to Texas last summer, and already, you know, a lot of people from what I've talked to and stuff, and even you and you know, family stuff, it was be careful because Texas is, you know, a red state, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, as a black person, things may not be safest for you. I was fortunate enough to have a pleasant time there. Heck, as rare as it was, not to say, you know, meeting a Republican person would have been a bad thing, but I thought Democrats were rare in Texas, and yet I met a Democratic Texan on a lift. Yeah,
Just a
right. We were
casual.
getting a lift back to the place I was staying, and I met the driver was a Democrat, and we ended up having a nice long discussion about just different things. And you know, like I said, not to say that Republicans would be any worse to meet, and you know, it's just that, you know, I thought, you know, perceptions itself can be, you know, can be misleading, but the
Yes.
fact that, you know, racism plays such a big role in, you know, the way we see the world and the way people are treated throughout the world, that you know, it's something that you can't really avoid as a black person when traveling. You know, you can't, you know, when I traveled to Italy, for example, you know, that was something that was on me and my family's mind. You know,
whether or not we'd be, treated differently, or there'd be, bad situations simply because we're black. And we've heard rumors and stuff about certain parts of Italy being quite discriminatory against, black people. And, once again, I was fortunate enough not to come across any of that, and were treated quite nicely where we went to. And the whole area was nice, and they have, from what I experienced, have quite positive view on Italy. But I'm aware that that's not the case everywhere, and as well as America. And, I don't, much like how I don't think it's fair to treat black people as a monolith, I don't think it's fair to treat anyone else or any other group of people as a monolith, because, we're all different. We all go through different struggles. We all have different views. And, as much as there could be, as much as life can throw its worst at you, it can throw its best. So, you're bound to come across good people as much as you're bound to come across bad people. So, it's important to take these, your perceptions of countries and not really, illustrate or, make your judgment entirely on those perceptions. But at the same time, the fact that race is a factor you have to take into consideration when traveling to another country is in itself tragic. So, yeah. I myself have not had to Google whether a country is racist per se, but yeah, I'd definitely say it's definitely not something I can't avoid thinking about.
Certainly, and you make a very important point there about not treating other groups as monoliths. I will say, in defense of Texas, I will say Texas, politically speaking at least, I know this isn't necessarily politically the political discussion, but Texas politically is becoming a lot more purple. So your experience in Texas, if you go in 20 years' time, I think will probably be, demographically speaking and politically speaking, a lot different. And I think your visit there, you're starting to see that it's becoming much more of a purple state. And Italy, I've been to Italy before. I went in 2014, so right when the refugee crisis was starting. I went to Rome.
Oh, right. I
visited Rome. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful city. And I think, there has been, I've heard from several folks saying that, there is racism in Italy, but of course, not all Italians are racist. We have to make that point clear. And I had a wonderful time in Italy, and you did too. Yeah. So, you're definitely right about, monoliths and things like that. I went to Malta a couple of years ago, and I did Google, is Malta a racist country? I clearly remember that. And I got the answer of not really. And I found that when I went there, the answer is not really. Although I think I did get a couple of people look at me, but it was nothing crazy. Malta's
the thing is, I don't feel because I understand that it's not unreasonable to expect that if you go to a country where there's not many of you there, that people are obviously going to be a bit surprised or taken aback or not exactly know how to act around you. But what people should know is that just because someone looks different to you doesn't mean you should treat them badly. It just means you should treat them with either, interest or curiosity, or if anything, just, the same way you treat a random stranger you meet across the street. Just because the color of my skin is different doesn't mean I'm an alien from outer space who, there's a 40% chance that I might, eat your children or something like that. Like, for example, I remember family going to Japan. My uncle was doing pull-ups in the outdoor gym, and there's literally just a crowd of Japanese people just staring and in like awe and wonder at my uncle just doing pull-ups from there. And they would constantly walk through like the streets, and they'd be bombarded by Japanese people wanting to take a picture with them, because you don't have that many black people in Japan. It was such a wondrous thing. And but it was nice to see that they weren't mistreated. It was something more just of wonder and, curiosity. And even that is how I would prefer, if you go to another country and they may not have many people of the same color as you there, that they treat you with somewhat, still with somewhat respect. So, yeah.
And that is a nice experience. And we just wish that was the same thing in many other countries. Being able to go to a country, even if they're not familiar, but at least being shown for some respect. It's nice, It's not much to expect. It's just, decency is always a good thing. A final scenario I'm going to give you: being black is accepting that you will be stopped at least once by police, regardless of your profession, and asked, "Is this your car?" Now, let me preface this by saying that we had just a couple of weeks ago, a couple in Ipswich was stopped for, quote, driving a motor vehicle on a road, unquote. And the reason why they were stopped was because they glanced at a police car which was near a relative's house of the couple.
Were the couple black?
I wonder what the answer
do I have to ask?
I wonder. Let me think about that. Give me a second. Let's take a second to think about that. Is the couple in question black?
I'll take that to mean yes. But, yeah.
Have you or your parents ever been stopped by police driving?
Not from memory. No, they have been stopped, but not in the sense that, for no cause whatsoever, as if, they were just rolling probable cause for no reason. But, as far as I'm aware, though, but I have heard stories of other family members. I remember another uncle in my family as well has been stopped for no reason. And, he did the funny thing of just politely interacting with, over politely interacting with the police officer and such from memory. But, it's a hard fact that many black people, especially in America, they have to, come to terms with, and definitely way too much black people feel that they have to come to terms with that. And in many cases they do. I mean, a lot of black people will go throughout their lives being needlessly stopped by police. I mean, for people our age and stuff, as for younger generations, that may be less of the case, as, police forces become less, prejudiced against black people. And, as times change, that may not be the case for us. But for many black people in the past, it has been. And for many black people now, it probably will be. So yeah, it is something that we have to come to terms with, that we will most likely be stopped by police for no reason, or just because we look like we might be doing crime or have done crime. And
that in itself is quite sad, right?
Yeah, that in itself is quite sad. And
that's
like
the
I said
point,
before,
isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, like I said before, though, I always still sympathize with police and the fact that they are just trying to do their jobs for the most part, but for an other, overly large part, a lot of police officers just need to overcome that association they have with black people and the prejudices that they have in their minds. So, it's sad, like you said, and that in itself is tragic. So
absolutely,
yeah.
It really is. Let me talk you through some statistics on stop and search, because this is very, very intriguing. When I read this morning, I had to think about even some of my own assumptions with stop and search, actually. So this is from a year and a half ago. These are the latest stats that I could find. So in 2018, the Met Police increased its use of stop and search, and there was a 19% rise amongst London's minority black population being stopped. And it says here, despite the fact there was an increase in black searches, those searches were less effective in detecting crime than those conducted on white people. And most stops done found no wrongdoing. So
was there a rise in, does the statistic talk about any rise in stop and searches on white people? Like, for comparison?
It rose by 5% for white people.
Wow, okay.
It rose by 5%. And for black people, it rose by 19%.
Okay, well,
No, you're right. There you go.
Yeah.
And bear in mind here, Nathaniel, that black people make up 15.6% of London's population, while white people make up 60% of London's population. But yet still, black folks are being stopped much more.
Yeah, almost triple the amount that triple the rise in stop and searches. So that's So
black people make up 16% of London's population, but were stopped 43% of the time. White people make up 60% of the population, but were only stopped 35% of the time. Now, here's the thing that I find very intriguing, because I had always assumed, tell me if this is a really bad thing to say, but I'd always assumed, look, black people, if you don't want to be stopped by police, then stop carrying knives, or stop, carrying guns, or stop shoplifting, or stop doing this, stop doing that. Take things into your own hands and actually take responsibility. That was always my thought. It was always, okay, you don't want to be stopped. Don't do anything stupid. Obviously, there's the race factor in there, which I take into account, of course.
Yeah.
But, my assumption was, look, you've got to take these into your own hands. The problem that the Met Police have now is that all of these stops are totally ineffective. And so now you have to ask yourself, what is going on at the Met Police? What is the institutional racism? We've had the McPherson report from the late 90s when Stephen Lawrence was killed, saying there was institutional racism. Institutional racism was a problem back then. And unfortunately, it now looks in 2019, 2020, is still a problem. Even though there's less crimes being committed by Black people, we're being disproportionately searched. What does that tell us about the state of play among the police in the UK?
I'll say for first thing that obviously it definitely would show from taking the impression that if that people are committing less crimes still as a population than before, and yet you're stopping searching them more and than white people, and there's an increased rise in the amount of stop searches on Black people and other minorities, more so than there is in white people, when you're encouraging more stop and searches. And more importantly, the fact that those stops and searches for the most part didn't come across showing that the people stopped and search were doing anything criminal at all, which shows that, number one, if you're stopping and searching more people and the people are searching, it means that you are basing the need to stop and search them on on factors which aren't actually related to crime. And for a lot of Black people, that is the case, where the way they dress and the way that they carry themselves and the perception that that most people, I guess, have of Black people from rap videos and grime videos and generally the way that we're portrayed for most part, which I'll get onto in a minute, has had its role on that perception. And so I think that it's not entirely unfair to say that for a lot of Black people, the way you carry yourself, if you carry yourself similar to how the average police person would see a criminal, they're most likely going to think that you're worth going to be stopped and searched. So maybe it would be better to carry yourself in a less criminal way. But for a lot of the part, it's important to also ask that, why does that not apply to white people? Because you never have the problem of someone telling a white person that maybe if you dress less than the criminal, you're going to get stopped and searched, because that's not a problem for white people. They could dress however the hell they want, and that's not a problem. They don't have to worry about being stopped and searched more because they're white. Why would they have to worry that their clothes are going to make them look like a criminal because they're white? And whilst I'm not going to say that every police officer is more likely to stop a Black person wearing let's say gangster clothes than a white person, at the same time, the problem is that too many police officers are more likely to stop a Black person wearing gangster clothes than a white person wearing gangster clothes, simply based on that. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And like I've said before, I think change has happened already and things are changing for the better. And whilst it definitely is a problem, institutional racism was definitely a problem of the past. And I would say arguably it's a problem that it is now. I wouldn't say it's maybe as big a problem as it was before. Whilst I'm not entirely adept on, how much more, like I said before, I'm not, well versed on all the statistics and, how the police force works and, news and stuff about, potential institutional racism. My belief is that, for the most part, most of the people in charge of the police force aren't, actively, or they don't really try and seek to discriminate against Black people. But the problem is that when you have a lot of people still in the system who still hold prejudices, even if they may not, intentionally exhibit them, or even if they don't actively think that black people are worth less than white people, it still comes out in their actions. And the whole stop and search incident and report you've just described is evidence of that. And it's evidence that more still needs to be done, if anything, to reform the police officers out there on the streets who will look at a black person wearing gangster clothes and a white person wearing gangster clothes and decide that the black person wearing gangster clothes is the bigger threat. So that needs to change. And it may be evidence of institutional racism, so I can't say that it's not, but at the same time, I will say that I don't think it's as bad as it was before, and things are getting better. So I don't think, it may be as effective here per se to defund the police or anything, but there definitely needs to be more done to improve the way the police force interacts with people of color and minorities, and improve, if anything, if for any reason, if anything, to improve its trust it has, that the public has with the police. Because you can't, a lot of the problems we have is that black people generally don't trust the police, and we have, in a lot of cases, good reason to. So if they want to have better interactions with the police, with people of color, they need to go about improving their relationship with us, and reforming both police officers' view of black people and improving on the connections and relationship that they have with black people, so, and
Absolutely.
minorities in general. So yeah.
Absolutely. I agree with pretty much everything that you said. Only thing I just want to make a point on, not a pushback, but I just want to be careful, when we talk about the way that black people carry themselves and not dressing in a way so as to get themselves arrested. I think that's it's a good point, but I think it can also be taken in a different it can be taken in a slightly different way as well. When you mentioned that, so like black people dressing up with like tracksuits behind like what go down on their waist and things like that. I think it's important
I said that that might be a factor leading that,
yes,
black people consider in terms of how they conduct themselves. But even then, I don't think it's fair to. For one thing, it's not the one justification that a police officer should have to stop and search someone. And also, I don't think it's fair to only hold black people to that account. If anything, if there is an account to hold people by, it seems that black people are the only people that are having to conduct themselves in a particular way, and white people don't.
yes.
So that was the full point I wanted to make.
Absolutely, because we've seen in the past. You look at examples like you look at women, for example, who are on a night out and dress a certain way, and people saying, well, women shouldn't dress this way because if they dress in a way that's risque, they put themselves at being raped, for example.
Yeah,
and that's obviously a very problematic argument. So I just wanted to make that clear that that's very that's a bit of a fine line that we have to be careful not to
exactly
cross over.
For that same reason, it's blaming the victim as if they're the reason why they're being mistreated, as if the women are asked to be mistreated simply because of the way the clothes they were wearing, and that's not the case at all.
Exactly. Just wanted to make that very clear. But I absolutely agree with everything you've said. Final thing before we go, how do we move forward is the big question that is being discussed. Some people want substantive change like reparations. There's been a lot of talk in the media in the last couple of weeks about statues. We saw Edward Colston's statue, of course, torn down in Bristol, and then ironically thrown into the same river that slaves are brought on to Bristol. That's how he made his money and things like that. We've got the statues debate and whether or not statues of linked to historical slavery should stay up. And then on the other side of culture, we have TV shows that are now being taken down because they are now seen to be offensive towards black people, minorities, and things like that. Let's start off with statues. What is your take on whether or not we take down statues? What do we do with these historical monuments?
Well, simply, my view on statues is that a statue in public should be put up to glorify people who deserve to be glorified. For example, Nelson Mandela, he, no one can disagree he deserves a statue because he was a great man who did great good for the world, and he deserves to be praised for and recognized for his accomplishments. Winston Churchill, which, you know, most recently has been a controversial figure. I believe his, you know, what he's done to push Britain through the war and stuff means that it's justified to want to have a statue of him. However, in the cases of Edward Colston and his statue in Bristol being thrown into the river, I don't think being a slave trade owner, not slave trader, being a slave trader and being, you know, an active slave trader, I don't think is you know, warrants you deserving a statue. And whilst, like I said before, I don't think violence and, you know, illegal acts is the best way to go about things. So maybe it may not have been the best thing for the people to throw in that statue in the river. At the same time, I can't blame them for it, because for a long time, especially in America, black people had to put up with people being glorified for and all the mistreatment that they've done to us being ignored and swept under the rug as if that's okay. They did this. Like Edward Colston, he did good in his community, and for Bristol, he funded and built a lot of public like schools and funded like hospitals and stuff like that. So I can't go against or hate on Bristol for wanting a statue, believing a statue of him deserves to be put up. But at the same time, you know, I can't hate on people wanting a statue to be removed for very good reasons. He was a slave trader, and, you know, that, in my opinion, means that he shouldn't be glorified as a person, because, you know, he publicly funded, you know, hospitals and schools, and then he you know, he actively took part in the slavery and cruelty of people of a different race simply because they were seen as inferior species. So which one is worse?
Absolutely.
So yeah, and that's how I think it should be seen. You know, I agree that statues, you know, we shouldn't erase history. It should be kept up. We should still have history so that we can look back and, you know, see history for what it was and then learn from it. Same way as how, you know, Germany views Auschwitz. They haven't burnt down Auschwitz because they don't want people to forget the crimes and horrors that happened there. But at the same time, they don't build a statue of a Jewish person being thrown into a gas chamber, because the statue is meant to glorify a person, and it's not the only way to remember history anyway. But at the same time, you know, you shouldn't have a statue of somebody who shouldn't be glorified. Same way as like how Jimmy Fat Savile statues were taken down when, you know, the news of him came about, despite all the good that he's done, all he had done in his life. You know, he did stuff that negated the fact that he, you know, he negated the fact that he was deserving of a statue. I mean, like, you know, to measure it up, he, you know, helped a lot of kids fulfill their dreams, and he also molested and raped a lot of kids. So, you know, it cancels each other out, and you've got to look at history prospectively, whether or not the person deserves to be glorified. And in the case of Edward Colston, I agree that he shouldn't have had a statue put up publicly. Maybe that statue should have been moved to a museum instead of thrown in the river. Sure. Where people can, you know, look at it with the perspective of having all the information about his life put on for display. But at the same time, you know, pictures and statues of people, for example, in America, there's a lot of Confederate statues still up, and that particularly doesn't make sense, for the number one reason being that the Confederacy fought against there being a united America in the first place, and for secondly, and most important reason, to be honest, the fact that they fought for mainly slavery to be, you know, institutionalized and maintained rather than abolished. Yep. Like they didn't fight. Like if they won, it's not like they would have wanted just honor and more states' rights. Then, you know, black people in America wouldn't be free. It's quite simple as that. So having statues of them makes it seem as if they were good people, and all they did in their life was for the better good. And, you know, having statues of people means that everything that they did in life, like overall, brought about good change for society. And I don't believe statues of people who didn't bring about good change, who wouldn't have and didn't bring about good change for society overall, like shouldn't be put up. So, you know, whilst I'm not really against people going around burning down statues and stuff, because, you know, it's something you could just asks for or demands for the statue to be taken down legally. You know, at the same time, I can't say it's unreasonable for people to want the statue to be taken down. And I think arguments saying that all statues should be kept up just so you can, you know, observe and, you know, appreciate history for what it was. You know, history can be good and bad, and, you know, statues aren't the only way to objectify it, to, you know, look back on history, and specifically because statues are meant to, you know, glorify history. So,
Exactly.
you know, when you have a statue of someone, it's somebody who can be looked up to as an icon and a model, and somebody who, you know, you want people to be in the future. And, you know, do you want people to be somebody who, you know, funds public schools and hospitals whilst also takes part in slavery? No, I don't want people to grow up to be that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think I definitely agree with your point about statues being either put into museums or having plaques on them detailing that they have complicated history. I think that's very important from an educational point of view. So even if the statue stays up, I think at least having something to say this person was involved in the slave trade.
Or in the very least,
that.
specifically praising them for a specific act. So if
Exactly.
there was a plaque put up, or even a statue of Evan Colston, yeah, it said specifically that, you know, he did this for Bristol, and that is what we recognize. I can't really go against that because they're recognizing that specific that he did, which, you know, at the end of the day has benefited a lot of people. But at the same time, you know, he also hurt a lot of people through his actions and contributed to an even bigger problem that, you know, had a much larger negative impact than the positive impact of him funding public schools. So, yeah, I agree with what you said.
Absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning that there were attempts in Bristol to remove the statue democratically, but they were always kicking the can down the road on that one. So I think it was a case of the anger being built up and they just had to take it down forcefully, which is, you know, interesting. And the scenes, watching those scenes of it being thrown in the river was just something else. On the entertainment industry, we've had a lot of TV programs taken off the air, a lot of apologies from TV presenters, comedians, actors for past mistakes, especially around blackface and playing characters of minorities. Obviously, the biggest example was Little Britain being taken off air, and Come Fly With Me as well. What do you make of taking TV programs off air that portray minorities in a certain way or that are played by white actors?
The thing is, I think it should be looked at, you know, it should be evaluated like fairly. Like, for instance, I also watched Come Fly With Me and I thought it was hilarious.
Me too.
In the case of, you know, being worried about blackface and stuff, like, I only have a problem with blackface when it's when number one is done in a specific way, because there was the minstrel show blackface, or, you know, the traditional blackface, which was, you know, black people being literal black skin and then big lips, and then being portrayed as just dumb, oafish characters with no common sense, who always had to be told the right thing to do by their white masters. Like, that was where blackface originated from. So now when we look at that, we need to, I don't think it should mean that nobody can, you know, paint their color of black skin, because, you know, we like in the film that's kept on being brought up in arguments about this, like White Girls or whatever, like, you know, dressing up as another person and stuff for comedic effect, in itself is not an offensive thing. It's only the way you portray that person doing it in a somewhat respectful way that's also comedic is you know, important. And when it comes to Come Fly With Me, I never thought that they were, you know, necessarily taking the mick out of black people, but more just a certain character making a comedic character.
Absolutely.
And it's important when it comes to, you know, whilst I'm happy that they're going through the efforts of trying to be, you know, show that they're trying to, you know, make their programming more, you know, showing that they're on board with the movement, and that they don't want to profit on shows that, you know, disadvantage or make fun of or disrespect certain community of people unfairly. At the same time, you've got to look at it from a certain standpoint, the fact that, you know, comedy is always meant to take the mick out of things for everybody's enjoyment.
like regardless of the topic, like jokes about 9/11, jokes about, you know, horrible events, like people laugh about these things to make themselves feel better and to, you know, as a sense of camaraderie or satire, as if, you know, we all understand it's ridiculous and therefore it's something we can all laugh at, because not that we think it's a great thing, but because we think it's ridiculous or we think it's funny. And, you know, that in itself is comedy. So I don't think, you know, maybe taking down Come Fly With Me or Little Britain will either, if anything, it won't really do anything to, you know, prevent or stop or, you know,
of course it won't.
Progress the fight against racism.
Of course
And more importantly, I think it's not necessarily the best thing that they like the right thing to do anyway.
Of course.
Like, you know, people can understand. I think people do understand. People should understand that, you know, you should take things in perspective of the time that they come in as well. Like, for example, Winston Churchill, he was a very controversial character, and he has said he did do a lot of racist things, and had said a lot of racist things. But, you know, looking at it from objectively, from a historical standpoint, you got to look at it from there. Like, you know, in a time where mistreating Black people was the norm and where people didn't have the hindsight of that, you know, Black people were equal, Black people deserve rights and stuff. You know, whilst it doesn't exactly make it good, and we shouldn't glorify that now, we should look at it objectively and not mean that everything that that person's done is now worthless or anything. Or even from the standpoint of a TV show, like, why is something that many people, even, you know, minorities and races enjoyed, why is that now a racist thing if different minorities at the time had no problem with it and nobody made complaints or anything? And whilst obviously that's not always the case, I think in the case of, you know, Little Britain and Come Fly With Me, that, you know, that may have not been the best decision to make. But I do appreciate the act of looking back and trying to make, you know, everything, you know, either the act of apologizing, I say, for past actions with hindsight. I think that's a good and powerful thing. Being able to look back and say, you know, we did the mistake, or we made a mistake, and we realized that it's something that, you know, what would have been offensive to a few people, and therefore that we apologize. Like the same way people, you know, with the whole thing, like cancel culture, I guess, and how people react to, you know, past tweets and stuff that, you know, may be offensive. Like, you can argue that what I thought was appropriate at the time, it doesn't change the fact that you can definitely see it's not appropriate now. So you can either stand by it and, you know, childlessly say, well, you know, I found it funny, it was a joke, and, you know, or you can just say, I'm sorry I offended you guys, I meant nothing, I didn't mean to offend you people, and for that I apologize. And if you see that it's not, and if it's definitely the wrong thing to do and you can see that, there's nothing wrong with being the bigger person and saying that, you know, I made a mistake, we made a mistake, and, you know, I'll delete what I did before, or I'll remove it because it doesn't represent the person I am right now. It doesn't represent the person I wanted to be. So yeah,
absolutely. And I completely agree with most of the points that you made. I think, you know, with the whole removing programs, I think what you said about broadcasters, you know, at least making the effort to look through their archives and apologize, that's a good step. But I'm a little bit skeptical. I think removing television programs from streaming services, I think it's too easy for broadcasters to just say, okay, we're dealing with the problem by getting rid of programs. You know, obviously, you know, okay, looking back, should Matt Lucas have played a character like Precious in Come Fly With Me in 2010? Probably not. I mean, you know, I was
not, but you know, at the same time, it was a funny character, and
it was funny. Listen, you know, Precious was funny, and I think Matt Lucas wasn't demeaning Black people. He was playing a character, obviously based on stereotypes, Christian, church-going woman, you know, things like that.
And the thing is, like, you should be able to objectively look at satire for what it is. It's taking the mick out of something, not because, or even just comedy. When you take the mick out of something, it's not necessarily because you hate it or because you love it. It's just because it's a funny thing that people can all laugh at. And
it's funny,
you know, that in itself. And there are a lot of Black people who, like, in real life would have acted like Precious in some cases, which is what made it funny. And you know, that if you play a character that is respectful of, you know, the origins stuff, also, you know, comedic, I think there's nothing wrong with that personally. But
yeah, like I said, and like you even agreed to, it's good that the broadcasters are making a step. But personally, what would be even better is not just going back and deleting stuff and saying, there, we did it.
Yeah.
We're not racist now. Like, just maybe make more programming that is much more, friendly to Black
Precisely.
people and other minorities. Maybe making a program that focuses on like an actual all Black cast of people, or making programs that talk about certain aspects of the Black experience, or programs that, other minorities would enjoy, rather than just, white people humor, as they would say.
Precisely.
Like, doing that would be a much bigger act than just going back and deleting old comedies that, number one, I'm sure many people may have forgotten by this point, or many people may not have watched, or many minorities probably wouldn't care about. Like, even if I really didn't care much that they deleted like little. I mean, it's your show anyway, so they have the right to delete it. But at the same time, like, why do I care? It's an old show they don't show anymore. It has no
Exactly.
relevance in today's society. So why would they care if you deleted it from your programming when, yeah.
Look,
So yeah, what they
delete-
could do better is to just actually release programming that is more, friendly to Black people, rather than just deleting stuff.
Exactly. Deleting programs is easy. It would be
Yeah.
so easy. It would be the simplest thing in the world for the BBC or ITV or BritBox or Netflix to just say, to have a disclaimer. Okay, we're in the Black Lives Matter era. Okay,
Yeah.
put a disclaimer at the top of the show. Little Britain, come fly with me, whatever, and say, please note that this programming contains scenes that contain blackface or cultural references which some viewers may find distressing. And I think that is more than enough. I don't think you should get rid of the show itself, because it's a really good show, and Matt Lucas's portrayal is, okay. In 2010, should he have played that character? Probably not, but it's funny. I don't find that offensive at all. I never even thought of it that way. And so I think broadcasters need to do more than just take programs away. They need to actually have the receipts to show they're taking steps. You look at, I'm obviously, there's obviously politics podcast. I love politics. I watch a lot of news and stuff. Where are all the Black political commentators in the UK? They're non-existent. They don't exist. You look at all the panel shows in the UK, all the political correspondents, the political editors, the political contributors, the analysts. None of them, you very rarely you find a Black face, and we talk about the United States a lot and for how racist the US is, but you turn on CNN and almost always you will have representation. You will have Black faces, Black people talking about Black issues. You
The
look at the
thing
George
is,
Floyd
like,
coverage and
you
stuff
want to
like
be
that.
careful with that though, because I don't think it should be the case that you have to have a Black face in something in order to show that you're being, because that's not it. Like, because
No,
that leads to, virtue signaling and saying and tick box behavior, where saying, look, we have a Black guy on here, or see, there's Black people, we have a Black president, so things aren't racist
yeah,
anymore. Like,
well,
simply having a Black face somewhere doesn't show anything other than there's a Black face
doesn't.
here, so clearly one person made it. Like, it's always nice to see, but at the same time, and obviously there are benefits of showing that do help help the movement, because being young and looking up and seeing a Black person on the news, or a black person on the television as a president, it proves that I could do that too. But at the same time, that's not all that needs to be done. There needs to be changes in the system. There should be changes in the actual organization of things and actual society. That means it's not just the case where Black people only coming up to these shows when a producer or an organization needs to show that they're on board with Black people, or that they're on board with Black Lives Matter. Like, they pick one person out of barrel and then job done. Like, it needs to be done where Black people can easily and seamlessly make their way into an organization, and an organization can just as likely be all Black as much as it is all white. And there should be no problem with that, and there should be no friction, and there should be no hit barriers preventing Black people from entering into a certain space, as there are to white people. In some cases there will be justified barriers to entering into a role, but the point is that there should be equal fighting ground for opportunities between all races, basically.
Absolutely, and that point you just made, as you said, it's a systemic problem, and I think that in the long term, that is something that not just broadcasters, but everybody, corporations, companies, society, public sector, everyone's going to have to seem to be tackling that problem now. And I think it's an area that a lot of attention is going to be focused on. But the systemic issues, I think, not just representation on a basic level, as I talked about, but as a system, I think definitely that is going to be the key issue into not just dealing with representation, but issues of police brutality, everyday racism, and things like that. I think that's definitely going to be a very key point going forward in the future. Nathaniel Brown, that was a very, very wide-ranging conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, yeah, no problem. I enjoyed it, and it was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Nonstop Politics. If you enjoyed, why not follow us on Instagram @Nonstop Politics? And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.